Back to America. So the Vikings were the first Europeans to arrive in the Americas that we know about. The Vikings' day was somewhat short-lived. After only a few years, the Vikings got back on their ships, perhaps because of Indian attacks, and headed back to Greenland. Eventually, from Greenland, the Vikings headed back to Iceland and back to Europe. It'd be another 500 years before another European ran across the Americas. When the Vikings got back to Europe, Europe was in chaos. At one time, Europe was very orderly, was very Europe was a very ruled area by the Roman Empire, which had set up a system to make sure their land was somewhat peaceful and productive. The Roman Empire maintained its peace by something called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. That is, they used their military to suppress revolts. The Roman Empire lasted to around 400 to 500 AD. It split really into two groups, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The empires were fighting among themselves. There were large waves of immigrants moving in. And so the Western Empire especially broke apart. And out of all this confusion, new countries were created. So by the time the Vikings arrived back in Europe, around 1200, Europe was a continent of many different groups and nations. One thing many of these groups and nations had in common, however, was they were all Christians. Christianity had moved into the empire, the Roman Empire, in the early 30s and 40s, and had by 313 or so had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so when the Roman Empire broke apart, many of these different entities, many of these different future countries maintained their Christian values, their Christian religion. One thing Christians had in common at the time in Europe was that as a Christian, if you could, one thing that you should always do during your lifetime was to go and visit the Holy Land, was to go and visit the places where Jesus walked, and where Jesus was born, and where Jesus died, and as the Christians believe, was resurrected. That was all well and good until about 1000, just as the Vikings were discovering North America, the Muslims rose up in the Middle East and took over what the Europeans called the Holy Lands. The Muslims at first were very hospitable to Christians who wanted to come visit the Holy Lands. And so Christians continued to come from Europe to the Holy Lands until a group of Turkish Muslims took over the Holy Lands and closed entrance. It's almost like they closed Disneyland, Disney World, and you couldn't go there anymore. This was very upsetting to many Europeans, and they decided to try to free the Holy Lands through the use of a military conquest, the use of crusades. The first crusade in 1097 was very successful. It freed Jerusalem, and the Holy Lands were opened up to Christians again. However, the Muslim Turks regained the Holy Lands. The Christians tried to free the Holy Lands again in the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, the Fifth Crusade, the Sixth Crusade, the Seventh Crusade, the Eighth Crusade, and the Ninth Crusade, but failed. One thing they did do while they were fighting in this area, however, was to realize that there was many things in this area that had been imported from India and China, things the Europeans believed they could really use, things like new types of clothing like silk from China, and certain spices like nutmeg and cinnamon from India and East Asia. Of course, you have to remember this time there was no refrigeration. So, for example, if you're a European royalty and you were throwing a big party and you had your archers and your hunters go out to kill meat, the meat would spoil and very quickly. And so through the use of these spices from the Middle East and from Asia, you could prolong the use of that meat and the meat would still taste good and smell good, etc. And of course, as rich royalty, you certainly did not want to be dressed like the ordinary peasants of the day, so using silk to dress in certainly showed how important you were. Of course, the only problem was with the Turkish Muslims holding the Holy Land. The Turkish Muslims did allow some of the spices and silks to be sold in Italy, and then the Italians would sell it at a much higher price to the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe, however, was going broke trying to afford these spices and silk from Asia. And so therefore they determined that if they couldn't break through the Middle East and get the spices and silks from Asia that way, they would go in a different direction. Of course, at the time, 1200, 1300, most Europeans did not have a nice world map like you do. They did not have satellites in the sky looking down on the earth telling them exactly where they were. Their maps basically composed of areas that we see in the yellow here, called the known world in 1400. So one of the first problems was how to get to Asia from Europe if this is the only part of the world that you know. Now, the good thing about this is that during this time period, the Europeans were developing new technology, including new types of ship, like the caravel. With the caravel and the sort of a triangular sails, you could actually now sail against the wind. Before, your sailing boat basically had a square sail, and whatever the wind direction blew you, that's the way you went. You didn't go in the other direction. But thanks to European technology, they were now designing these new crafts that could sail not just hundreds of miles, but thousands of miles into the ocean, and even sailing against the wind. That combined with some technology they had found in the Middle East and had imported from Asia called the astrolabe, which allowed for them to know what latitude they were on, that is how far north and south, and using their compass direction-wise, north, south, east, west, now meant the Europeans could sail much further from land than they had ever dreamed of before. The first group in Europe to try to get to Asia by using a water route were the Portuguese. In 1419, Henry the Navigator, as he was called, established a school, a sailing school in Portugal, and started to send out sailing ships to go down the African coast to try to get around Asia. Again, at the time, however, the Europeans didn't realize how long Africa was. They were just familiar with maybe a few hundred miles of northern Africa. They didn't realize that Africa was a very large continent, and the African continent extends south of the equator. But nevertheless, year after year, the Portuguese sent out more and more ships. They somewhat sort of bounced off Africa, going further and further and further and further south along the way. Finally, in 1497, one of the expeditions the Portuguese sent out had turned the corner and had sort of turned the corner around Africa, and they were of good hope that they would be able to reach India. Unfortunately, a storm drove them back, and that expedition had to sail back to Portugal. But they brought back the good news that they knew where Africa ended. And the next expedition, 1498, under Da Gama, sailed several cargo ships down around the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in India. Despite losses, the one cargo ship that arrived back in Portugal had so much spice on it and silks that basically it brought back about 60 times what the expedition had cost. That is, of all the men that were lost and all the ships that were lost and all the money the Portuguese spent on the expedition, they earned 60 times as much as they had spent on the expedition just with one ship filled with the spices. That's how rich the rich stuff was. Now, the Portuguese wanted to make sure that they maintained this route. They didn't want other Europeans using this route because the Portuguese not only intended to use the spices for themselves, but also intended to sell their leftovers to other Europeans at a very high price. So they wanted to guard this route, and they started building forts along the African coast so no other nation in Europe could use this route. So other nations would have to use other routes. Just about this time, this is where Christopher Columbus comes in. Christopher Columbus was a Genoese that was a part of what we now know as Italy today. And Christopher Columbus had come up with a scheme, an idea that he could sail west to get to the east. That is, he could leave Spain and Portugal and sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and that would actually get him to India and China. Now, in the early 1400s, Christopher Columbus had located the Spanish king and queen. He had actually asked the king and queen of France and the king and queen of Portugal and several other members of royalty to sponsor his expedition, but all of them had turned him down. Of course, the Portuguese said, hey, we're about to turn the coast of Africa. We don't need your help. The French were basically saying, we're going to be sailing north to get to India and China. We don't need your help. And so at last, Christopher Columbus turned to the Spanish. When he arrived at the Spanish court where the king and queen were, he presented his information, and the king and queen says, well, that's an interesting idea, and as soon as the war is over, come back and we'll consider your idea. You see, Spain was at war and had been at war for 700 years. 700 years earlier, northern African Muslims had invaded Spain and had taken almost all of it over. And the Spanish had been fighting for 700 years to get their country back. Finally, in 1492, they took over the last Muslim stronghold and reunited their country and invited Christopher Columbus back. Now, Columbus met the king and queen. The king thought he was a nut. The royal advisors thought he was a nut. The royal advisors said, look, the world is just so big. You'll never be able to take these small ships and sail basically 3,000 miles. That's all our ships can go, about 3,000 miles. And Chris, the Atlantic Ocean is just so big, you won't be able to get to Asia and China before you ran out of supplies. Christopher Columbus thought this earth was much smaller, and he was wrong in that regard. But Christopher Columbus had some knowledge about the sea. He had actually been a sailor and had sailed all the way to Iceland on some voyages. He had sailed all the way to West Africa on other voyages with the Portuguese. He had sailed the Mediterranean, and during his voyages, he recognized there was some type of ocean current in the Atlantic, almost like a circle that was circling around that would basically take him to Asia and bring him safely back. Of course, what Christopher Columbus and the royal advisors did not know was that there was land in the way. The map you see here in 1474, notice that in the brownish areas, which is all the Europeans had mapped, there was nothing in the way between Spain and what they called Cathay or China. There was an island off Cathay, but that was basically in Asia as well. And so they thought you could just sail across the ocean with nothing in your way. Oh, the Vikings had mapped their discovery, but of course the Vikings in North America had just been at a little, they hadn't explored very much. And so basically they just thought North America, what we know North America, was only around 100 miles. And they had mapped that as an island called Antillia. If you look at the map closely, you can see Antillia. They mapped it the wrong place, but so their maps weren't very good. And so that's one reason Columbus thought he could just sail across because he thought the earth was much smaller and he thought there was nothing in his way. Even though the king thought he was a nut, the queen really liked his religious beliefs. He was a very strong Christian Catholic, and she was a very strong Christian Catholic, and so she convinced the king to sponsor his expedition across. In 1492, Christopher Columbus was given 3 ships and 90 men to make his voyage. The first thing Christopher Columbus did was not to sail west, he sailed south. Because he believed that ocean current was going to help him, the first thing he needed to do was sort of find that ocean current. So he sailed south to a group of islands called the Azores, found the ocean current, and then sailed to what he thought was China. Now his voyage lasted about 30 days. Now today, if you have a sailing ship and you're sailing basically from the Azores to the Caribbean, you can still get there in about 30 days. That's how fast the current takes you if you have a wind-drawn vessel. So basically, Christopher Columbus got there as fast as anybody could get there. And when he sighted land in the Caribbean, he believed he was in Asia. And as he looked around for the next several months, he still believed he was in Asia. He found, strange foods they didn't have in Europe. He found some spices they didn't have in Europe. And of course, the Native Americans he ran across, they were very different from Europeans. And so he believed he had arrived in Asia. Now, Chris was a great sailor, but one of the ships that was in his 3-ship fleet, that commander ran his ship aground and basically destroyed that ship. And so Chris could not take back all of his men with him when he went back to Spain. Instead, he left some of them to build a fort on the island of Hispaniola, which now has Haiti and the Dominican Republic on it. And he left some of his men there saying, I'll be back. Then Christopher Columbus in 1493 found that ocean current to take him back across the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, the time he sailed was hurricane season. So there was a hurricane in his way, but Chris was such a great sailor, he managed to sail his 2 wooden sailing ships through the hurricane without losing a man or losing a ship. He arrived back in Spain in 1493 to great welcome because the Spanish believed he had found a water route to Asia. He found the rich stuff. He had brought back some of those Asians, what we know as Native Americans, with him, along with spices and foods. And so the king and queen were very pleased and decided to sponsor another voyage. On his second voyage, he did not have 3 ships and 90 men. Instead, Christopher Columbus had 17 ships and 1,200 men, along with horses and cattle and sheep and everything you would need to stay where you were going. So the whole purpose of this expedition was to set up a trading post in China, in Asia, to trade with the Asians. Of course, when they arrived, they set up a trading post, all right, but they weren't in Asia. Columbus kept coming back 4 times. And that's why Christopher Columbus is important. It's not just that he came, he saw, and he left, but he came, he saw, and he kept bringing himself back and a lot of other people back. And from that time on, the Americas were attached, at least commercially, at least in a trading route, at least in some way with the rest of the world. That was his genius. And so what had become a voyage of discovery had become a voyage of colonization. The Spanish were coming back, and they were coming back to stay.